So in the last video, I went through 4 of the big steps that we could take to restore some common sense to our tax system. In this video, I just want to take you through the one big idea that you're bound to hear more about this year, and that is a net wealth tax. Wealth taxes have been around as an idea since the 1970s. They've often failed because they've been quite small amounts of tax on very, very large numbers of people. A few years ago, a few brilliant people came together in the Wealth Tax Commission to help us rethink how a wealth tax could actually work. And it came up with some really big, bold, and crucially quite simple ideas. The basic idea is that you have a net wealth tax of about 1% or 2% on the 22 largest fortunes worth over £10 million. Now, the virtue of this idea is it's a low amount on a very small number of fortunes. So rather than sending our tax inspectors out to try and check what thousands and thousands of fortunes are worth, it would actually allow us to zero in on the 22,000 biggest fortunes in the country. However, there are a lot of issues in helping get a wealth tax right. The first question is, who do you actually levy the tax on? Do you levy the tax on adults? Do you levy the tax on children who may also be, I don't know, the heirs of very rich estates? Do you levy the tax on couples? Do you introduce some kind of married couples allowance? Do you levy the tax on citizens, or do you levy the tax on residents? What about non-doms who have already been hit with lots of extra tax already? Answering those basic questions about who you actually levy the tax on is probably the first design question that needs answering. The second question is then, what fortunes do you actually levy the tax on? So for example, do you levy it on property? If you levy it on property, do you levy it on the main residence? Do you levy it on the house minus the mortgage, or just the total value of the residence? Do you then levy the tax on every other asset? But what if those assets are outside the country? Can you levy the tax on those assets? Or do you just levy the money on the assets which are actually on the shores of the British Isles? How do you then value some of the assets which might be in fast moving markets? For example, in the art market. If art prices are booming, then how do you value how much a particular painting is worth? How do you value the shares that somebody might have in maybe a private company that is unlisted and where the value of that company isn't very clear? So, second big question, how do you make sure that you're levying the tax on the right things? Which are the things that are kind of inside the fence that you levy the tax on? The third question is, when do you levy the tax? So would you levy the tax on assets when they were transferred? In which case, would you net off the amount of money that somebody bought that asset for? So you're only taxing the increase in wealth. Would you tax it on death? Because we've just changed a lot of the inheritance tax laws in some quite controversial ways. So that question of when you levy the tax, is it annual? Is it a one-off? Is it over many, many years? Again, you've got some big questions about timing that you've got to answer too. The fourth question is, how much do you set the tax rate at? So there have been a couple of ideas in the mix here. So Patriotic Millionaires, I think I'm right in saying, are arguing for a 2% tax on net wealth. And others have said that you maybe want to set the tax at about 1%. Here's the way to think about it. If you set a 1% tax on the 22,000 biggest fortunes in the country, that brings you about £11.9 billion a year. That is an awful lot of money. And so if you double it, you're then low 20 billion basically comes into the exchequer. And then the fifth question is, how do you actually get the money through the door? And here you've got to basically figure out the answer for those who might be asset rich, but they might be cash poor. So here again, there are different answers. It could be that you put a charge on the particular portfolio of assets, or maybe on somebody's property, and you take the money that is owed once that asset is liquidated. But again, we shouldn't underestimate how difficult it is to actually get the timing of when that money comes in if you've got people in that asset poor and cash rich position. Now, the Wealth Tax Commission and indeed Patriotic Millionaires have done a brilliant job at cutting through many of these questions. And again, the insight that is perhaps most important is that if you levy that small tax on a very small number of fortunes, then it's much, much easier to, for example, check at what people have got a particular asset insured at, for example. It's possible to actually devote a bit of time to really understanding how much something is worth. If you've only got 22,000 tax assessments to make, it's much easier to get that calculation right. And again, let's remember how much money is at stake. A 1% net wealth tax brings you almost 11 to 12 billion pounds a year. Even if you did that as a one-off, it could make a huge difference to us being able to, for example, build that national sovereign wealth fund into a bigger amount of money. The great irony about this debate is that we were one of the first countries to build exactly the national asset register that you need in order to answer this question. If you go off to Kew Gardens and visit the National Archives, you can find there, deep in these temperature-controlled rooms, the original copies of the Domesday Book. These were the books that were put together by the early Norman conquerors that went through the entire country to work out who owned what and therefore who should pay what to the king. We have had a long history of deep arguments about tax and the justice for tax in this country. Indeed, we are a country that had a civil war over the tax raising powers of the king. So, we have had a long history of debating tax in this country. Where do I come down? Well, right now, today, as I talk to you, I don't think we necessarily have all of the information that we need on hand in order to levy a net wealth tax. But what do? Do we just kind of give up on the idea? Well, the idea that I come down on in the book, Inequality of Wealth, is that we should actually be introducing something like a 0.001%, a nominal tax on all assets, because what that would force us to do, and force rich people to do, is to basically begin documenting their assets. If we coupled this with transparency into tax havens, we could then begin to assemble a clear picture of who owned what, and that would give us a lot more precision in actually calculating a tax policy that would help, I suppose, levy a fair tax on those windfall gains that the very richest have enjoyed because of low interest rates and because of some of the ways our marketplace works over the last 10 to 15 years. So this is a debate, I suspect, that is going to get bigger and bigger over the next few years. So if you're interested in following this debate about how we fix the inequality of wealth in our country, then please do subscribe to this video. I'd love to know what you think about some of the arguments at play here. So please just leave us your comment. And of course, if you'd like to get a copy of the book, then you can get your copy from the inequalityofwealth.co.uk or wherever you buy your books. Hope you enjoy it. Please let you know what you think.